Okay, so imagine this, right? Imagine a world just overflowing with food,
Yeah.
like fields bursting with crops, supermarkets just absolutely packed with produce. There's enough food to feed every single person on this planet. But, and here's the crazy part, millions of people are still going to bed hungry every night. So
Mm.
it's kind of a paradox, isn't it? And that's exactly what we're diving into today.
It really is. It's a paradox with, like you said, so many pieces and so many moving parts. And for this deep dive, we're going to be taking a look at an excerpt from an article called ¿Por qué el hambre persiste en un mundo de abundancia alimentaria? And it was inspired by Vaclav Smil's book, How the World Really Works. Have you had a chance to read that one yet?
I have not gotten to that one yet, but it's definitely on my list, especially after reading this excerpt. It's so fascinating.
Yeah, and it really gets you thinking because, today we're hoping to kind of untangle this whole disconnect between why hunger persists in a world that, on the surface at least, appears to have more than enough food for everyone.
It's such a huge question. And to be honest, I'm already feeling a little overwhelmed just thinking about all the different factors involved. But I think a good place to start is with something concrete, some hard data. And there's this FAO statistic that really stopped me in my tracks. It says that 30% of global food production, which is like a mind-blowing 1.3 billion tons of food, is wasted every single year.
It's a staggering amount, isn't it? And that's just the food that's produced. We're not even talking about the resources that go into growing it, the water, the land, the energy. It's just mind-boggling.
I mean, to put that into perspective, we're literally throwing away enough food to feed hundreds of millions of people. That's already a huge part of the problem right there.
Right. And it's important to remember that this waste is happening at all stages of the supply chain. So, from the farm to the processing plant to the supermarket to our own homes, there are opportunities for loss and waste at every step.
And we're not even talking about the economic barriers to access yet.
Right, because even if we magically eliminated all food waste tomorrow, we'd still have this massive issue of affordability and access because over 3.1 billion people around the world are living on less than 2.50 a day. So for them, it doesn't really matter how much food is being produced if they simply can't afford to buy it.
There's such a crucial point. It's not just about having enough food. It's about making sure that food is accessible and affordable to everyone.
It is, and it's not just about individual incomes either. We need to look at the broader systemic factors that contribute to poverty and inequality, things like access to education, healthcare infrastructure. All of those things play a role in determining who has access to food and who doesn't.
It makes you think about how unevenly resources are distributed around the world. I mean, think about a country like Brazil. They dedicate vast amounts of land to growing soybeans, primarily for export to countries like China and the U.S., while in a country like Ethiopia, millions of people are facing food shortages because of things like drought and conflict.
Right, and that's a really stark example of how global systems often prioritize certain markets and certain needs over others.
And the situation in Ukraine right now just highlights how fragile those global systems can be. The war has disrupted wheat and sunflower oil supplies, which has had a ripple effect on food prices and availability all over the world. I was reading that countries like Somalia are being pushed closer to famine because of it.
It's heartbreaking, and it really underscores how interconnected our food systems are. What happens in one part of the world can have a profound impact on people thousands of miles away.
And to add another layer of complexity to this whole issue, our modern food systems are incredibly reliant on energy.
That's one of the key points that Vaclav Smil makes in his book. He argues that our entire food system is built on this foundation of cheap and abundant fossil fuels.
That's not something I would immediately associate with food, but I'm guessing there's a deeper connection here.
Absolutely. I mean,
Right.
think about it. Most of the fertilizers that are used in modern agriculture are produced using natural gas. So when the price of natural gas goes up, the price of fertilizer goes up too. And that has a direct impact on the cost of food.
Oh, wow. So when we saw those huge spikes in energy prices back in 2022, it must have had a significant impact on farmers all over the world.
It did. In countries like Pakistan, farmers were forced to abandon their crops because they simply couldn't afford to buy fertilizer. And here in Europe, food prices soared as a result of the energy crisis. It was a real wake-up call for a lot of people.
It really shows how vulnerable our food system is to these kinds of shocks and disruptions.
It does, and it highlights the need to transition to a more sustainable and resilient food system, one that's less reliant on fossil fuels and more in tune with the natural world.
So we've got waste, we've got affordability, we've got energy dependence, and all of this is before we even factor in things like climate change and population growth. It's starting to become clear why this disconnect between food abundance and hunger is so difficult to solve.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but I think by understanding the root causes of the problem and exploring the different factors involved, we can start to identify solutions that might actually work.
All right, so we've laid out some of the key challenges, but where do we go from here? What are some potential solutions to this problem? How do we start to bridge this gap between abundance and access?
Well, that's a great question, and one that we'll dive into in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned. Well, there are no easy answers, are there? But, I think one of the most promising areas we could focus on is reducing food waste. I mean, remember that 30% that we talked about earlier? If we could even just make a small dent in that number, it would have a huge impact.
Yeah, I see what you mean. But how do you even begin to tackle a problem that's so global and so multifaceted? It feels like there's so many different factors at play, from like infrastructure challenges in developing countries to, just consumer habits in wealthier nations. It's a lot.
It is. It's a complex puzzle for sure, but each piece is important, you know?
Right.
For example, investing in better infrastructure in developing countries could significantly reduce post-harvest losses. We talked about those tomatoes rotting in fields in Nigeria. Well, if they had better refrigeration and transportation, those tomatoes could reach markets and consumers instead of just going to waste.
Right, so it's about addressing the specific needs of different regions and finding solutions that actually work within those contexts.
Yeah.
But what about in places like the U.S., where waste is often driven by things like, you know, aesthetic standards or people just buying more food than they need? How do you change those patterns?
Well, that's where innovation and I think shifts in consumer behavior come in. We need to rethink our obsession with perfect produce and find creative ways to use food that might not meet those arbitrary standards. There are already companies out there doing some really interesting things in this space, like selling boxes of ugly produce at a discount or using food scraps to create new products.
Yeah, I've seen those ugly produce boxes popping up in stores. It's a great way to reframe our thinking about what makes food valuable.
Exactly, and it's about recognizing that aesthetic imperfections don't actually diminish the nutritional value of the food. And beyond individual choices, I think there's also a role for policy changes. Some
Mhm.
countries are implementing taxes on food waste or offering subsidies for businesses that find ways to utilize surplus food.
Those are great examples of how governments can incentivize more sustainable practices. But even if we make significant progress on reducing waste, we still have this massive issue of equitable access to food. How do we ensure that everyone, regardless of their economic circumstances, can afford a nutritious diet?
That's where things get really tricky, and where I think Smil's perspective is particularly relevant. His work highlights this inherent tension between a globalized free market system and the need for greater equity in food distribution.
So are you suggesting that we need to fundamentally rethink the way global food systems operate? I mean, globalization has made food more widely available and affordable in many parts of the world, right?
It's true. It's definitely made food production more efficient, but
Mhm.
it's also created the system where profits often take precedence over the needs of the most vulnerable populations. And we see this, in the way that agricultural subsidies often benefit large corporations and in the fact that food often travels thousands of miles from where it's grown to where it's consumed.
So maybe it's not about abandoning globalization entirely. What about finding ways to make it more equitable and sustainable?
Right. I think that's a good way to frame it. Could we shift our focus to investing in local and regional food systems, which could reduce our reliance on these long and complex supply chains? Could we reform agricultural policies to ensure that they benefit small farmers and vulnerable communities? I think those are some of the key questions we need to be asking ourselves.
So it's starting to feel like we need a multi-pronged approach, you know, reducing waste, rethinking global trade investing in local food systems. These are all pieces of the puzzle, right?
They are. And while we're talking about these big picture solutions, let's not forget the crucial role that humanitarian aid plays. Organizations like the World Food Program are literally saving lives by providing emergency food assistance to people in crisis situations.
But as we discussed earlier, their budget is absolutely dwarfed by the amount of money that's spent on agricultural subsidies.
Yeah.
If we're truly serious about ending hunger, it seems like we need to rethink those priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. Governments need to step up and invest more in humanitarian aid reform, agricultural policies that perpetuate inequality, and take a more proactive approach to addressing the root causes of food insecurity.
It's all connected, isn't it? It's not just about producing enough food. It's about creating a system that ensures everyone has access to the nutrition they need to thrive.
Exactly. And that requires not only systemic changes, but also, I think, shifts in individual mindsets. We need to see food as more than just a commodity. It's a fundamental human right, and we need to act accordingly.
That's a really powerful statement, and it's definitely a lot to ask, but it also feels incredibly necessary.
Mm.
We can't simply accept a world where millions of people are going hungry while food abundance exists elsewhere. But at the same time, we can't ignore these looming challenges of climate change and population growth that we talked about earlier. How do we even begin to prepare for a future where food security is likely to be even more precarious than it is today?
Well, that's a really important question and one that I think we need to grapple with as a global community. But, I do believe that there are ways to build more resilient food systems and address these challenges head on. And that's something that we can explore further in the next part of our deep dive.
So we're facing these massive challenges, right?
Yeah.
Climate change, a growing global population. It can feel a bit overwhelming, to be honest. Like, what can we actually do as individuals in the face of these huge systemic issues?
Yeah. It's easy to feel that way, but I think it's important to acknowledge that feeling of overwhelm because it's something that a lot of people share. And I think it's important to remember that while individual actions alone won't solve global hunger, they're not insignificant either. Our choices as consumers, as citizens, can contribute to a larger movement for change.
Okay, so what are some concrete things that we can do in our daily lives to actually make a difference? I'm thinking about, the people listening to this right now who want to feel empowered rather than paralyzed by the scale of the problem.
Well, I think a good place to start is with food waste.
Hmm.
Being more mindful of what we buy, how we store our food, and how much we actually consume, those seemingly small actions, they can collectively have a really big impact. And supporting businesses that are prioritizing waste reduction is another way that we can kind of vote with our wallets.
Right, so it's about shifting our mindsets, right? Seeing food as something precious rather than something disposable. But what about those bigger systemic changes? What can we do to kind of push for those?
Yeah, I think beyond your personal consumption habits, think about becoming an advocate for change within your community. You can support organizations that are working to combat hunger, get involved in conversations about food justice, reach out to your elected officials to voice your support for policies that promote sustainable and equitable food systems.
It's empowering to think that, even those small actions can ripple outwards and create a larger impact.
Hmm.
But I want to get back to climate change and population growth for a minute. How do we build more resilient food systems in the face of these forces?
Innovation is key, I
Yeah.
think. Investing in the research and development of drought resistant and heat tolerant crops is going to be crucial. And we need to explore alternative farming practices that reduce our reliance on things like chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Those are really important pieces of the puzzle.
I've been hearing a lot about regenerative agriculture lately. Is that part of the solution?
Yeah. Regenerative agriculture is definitely promising. It focuses on practices that rebuild soil health, increase biodiversity, and sequester carbon from the atmosphere, all of which are essential for creating a more sustainable and resilient food system.
So it's about moving away from those practices that are depleting our soil and moving towards methods that are actually restoring and regenerating it. It makes you realize that the health of our food system is completely interconnected with the health of our planet.
Exactly. It's all connected. And beyond those practices, there's a lot of exciting research happening in areas like vertical farming, precision agriculture, and even lab grown meat. These innovations could potentially play a really significant role in increasing food production while minimizing our environmental impact.
It's fascinating to think about how technology might be able to help us address some of these age-old challenges, but I imagine technology alone isn't enough.
No, you're absolutely right. We also need to address the social and economic inequalities that contribute to food insecurity.
Mhm.
This means investing in things like education, healthcare, social safety nets to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to not only survive, but to thrive.
It all comes back to that interconnectedness, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We can't solve hunger in isolation. It requires a holistic approach that tackles the problem from multiple angles.
Hmm.
Recognizing that complex interplay of social, economic, and environmental factors.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The issue of food abundance versus hunger is complex, it's multifaceted, and frankly, it can be really overwhelming. But there is hope by acknowledging the scale of the challenge, embracing innovation, and working together towards a more just and sustainable food system. We can make a difference.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. We've explored, the realities of food waste, the complexities of global supply chains, and that urgent need for systemic change.
It's a lot to process, but I think it's so important that we have these conversations. I agree. And for anyone who's listening who wants to kind of dig a little bit deeper into these issues, I highly recommend checking out Vaclav Smil's book, How the World Really Works. It's a dense read, but it'll definitely challenge some assumptions, and provide you with a much deeper understanding of the interconnected systems that shape our world.
That's a great recommendation. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. A huge thank you to you, expert speaker, for sharing your expertise and insights with us and to our listeners. Thank you for tuning in, and keep exploring these issues, keep having conversations, and keep looking for ways to make a positive impact in your own lives and your communities. Until next time, keep diving deep.